Hi everybody, it's Laura from Green Tree, and I am here today to talk about bread, because who doesn't love bread? Sandwich bread, big old rolls of bread, fancy twists, there's all sorts of them out there. And obviously I can't talk about every kind of bread today because that would just take way too long, but I'm going to go over the basics and kind of explain to you the main subtypes of bread. So, probably the first one that most people think of is a yeast bread. This is typically what a sandwich bread is going to be made from. It's also most kinds of dinner rolls and other types of loaves. So, Chris, it just popped up that Chris is watching and he's right there. So I'm going to try not to look at him while I do this. So yeast breads are the type of bread, they kind of have a little squish to them. They tend to be relatively soft, and they are risen by baking yeast. The type that comes in little packets or you can scoop out of a jar. It's kind of a pale beige color. And that type of yeast interacts with the sugars in bread to create those nice little bubbles that give us those soft sandwich loaves. Now, the thing about yeast breads is that they come in many different shapes and sizes, and they also have another kind of subset called sourdough. So some people think of sourdough as a yeast-free bread, but it's not exactly. While most types of loaf breads are made with baking yeast, you're getting only one strain of yeast, sourdough breads are actually made from a mixture of different wild yeasts in a starter culture. So there is still yeast there, but it's the typical like airborne types of yeast, and that's why you'll get so many different flavors. If you keep and feed a sourdough starter for long enough, it will take on a different flavor than when you got it, because there are different types of yeasts in your kitchen, in your area, than there are wherever that sourdough starter started. Which is also why you'll get different flavors in sourdough breads from different areas of the world, different parts of the country, because there are different types of wild yeast prevalent and visible in the air there. And they're going to float down and get into your starter. Now, the thing that both regular yeast breads and sourdough breads have in common is that they are all kind of risen from the same type of process where you are kneading the dough and then putting it out to proof and rise. So that process is possible because these breads contain gluten. Gluten is a compound in wheat flours and other related flours that comes when you work and knead together two different types of proteins that are in the bread, gliadin and glutenin. And when you knead those together, you get this stretchy product called gluten. It is possible to make these breads without a gluten-containing flour. However, something like this, where you can see this has the same kind of squishy sandwich bread texture that you're seeing in the other loaves, and this is gluten-free, but you are going to have to add some other kind of sticky binder in order to let the yeast do its work. Because when the yeast grows inside of a sandwich bread like this, whether it's from a sourdough starter or from baking yeast, it is actually giving off little bubbles of gas as a waste product, and that's what gives you this texture. But if there's no gluten, the bread can't stretch and the air will just work its way out. So if you're making your own, you need to add something like xanthan gum. There are other types of binders you can use, things like arrowroot powder. You can get pre-made flour blends that already have these binders in them, but you need something to keep that dough stretchy so that when the yeast ferments and consumes the different sugars in the bread, it can create those little bubbles, and instead of just popping and going out of the top of the bread, they can form and stay inside. And you'll also notice different types of bread will have different sizes of bubbles, and that'll be from different types of yeast and from a different amount of sugar in the dough, creating different amounts of gas put off by the yeast. So, yeast bread and sourdough bread. Another type of bread is soda bread, and soda bread is typically risen by a reaction, a chemical reaction with baking soda and some kind of acid. So if you've ever made one of those like science fair volcanoes where you mix together baking soda and vinegar and it kind of explodes, that is how you are making soda bread. You're taking an acid, which is typically buttermilk, but sometimes maybe lemon juice, and mixing it with baking soda, and it creates a bunch of tiny bubbles very quickly. So there's no proofing and rising stage like there is with the yeast breads. Now, the advantage of that is it is much faster. However, you don't get that stretch. It's going to have a much more crumbly texture. A lot of biscuits are actually soda breads. That typical kind of like Bisquick biscuit or soda biscuit is a soda bread, where that quick chemical reaction rises your biscuit. You get that crumbly, soft texture. You can't slice it and make a sandwich out of it the same way that you can with the yeast bread, but it still tastes really good. That's why the texture is different, is because of the different leavening agent, baking soda instead of yeast. Now another kind of hybrid, and this is what I'm going to be sampling today, is a quick bread. Now a quick bread can be risen with either yeast or chemical reaction, like with baking soda or using eggs as the leavener. And you're going to get this denser, more cake-like texture in a quick bread because of that reaction. Now you can use yeast, but when you use yeast, you're baking it after that first rise. You're not beating it down and proofing it like in a standard yeast bread. Quick breads tend to be sweet, but they don't have to be. And like I said, this is the one that I'm sampling today, is the classic banana bread. This one is made with wheat flour, so you can see it does have those little bubbles in it, even though it's not a regular yeast bread with all that rise. But again, like with a soda bread, it's got a crumblier texture, and you'd be a lot harder pressed to make a sandwich out of this, although now I kind of want to try. So then we also have flatbreads. Flatbreads are things like pita and naan and lavash. They tend to be very thin. Like you can see how thin these loaves are. Like each one of these pieces is considered a loaf of pita bread. However, they're flat. And the reason for that is they either have no yeast, or the yeast is there just for flavor and not for rising. I will say pita is a little unusual in that the yeast is what creates that kind of pocket inside. There's enough rising to kind of create that space, but the way that it's cooked lets the layers of bread separate as it cooks and gives you that nice little pocket. But again, flatbreads don't actually have to have any kind of leavening agent in them in order to make them have this lovely chewy bread texture when you're finished. So those are the main kinds of breads that we're talking about. We've got yeast breads, sourdough breads, quick breads, flatbreads, soda breads. They're all delicious. Pretty much all of them can be made, as I said, gluten-free, so long as you add in the right agent to replace the stretchiness of the gluten. They all involve some kind of a basic dough made out of grains, and each one is going to have, even the flatbreads, some kind of leavener to keep them from just being like a pancake, although that has a leavener too and is a whole other topic. But yeah, they're very different. You're all going to get quite different textures, despite the fact that the base of nearly all of them is flour and water. So if you want to try quick bread today, come down, check out the banana bread. If you have any favorite kinds of breads, feel free to share that with us in the comments. I love bread, and I'm always curious to hear about that, or any favorite recipes. And I hope you guys are enjoying this Friday and that you get to eat some bread today. So that's it. Have a good one. Bye.